Seeking Level, Chapter 11. Hunk led Keith to his natural habitat, the kitchen, where it was warm, the scent of his latest culinary creation still present. This was not where Keith had thought they were going, and he was also surprised to see Pidge and Shiro already there, seated at the table, out of uniform, finishing their own bowls of soup. Keith closed up inside as he realized he was the last one again. Was he even part of this team? But then Shiro stood to welcome him, and he relaxed a little into the familiarity of the gesture. He didn't know about the rest of them, but he knew he could count on Shiro. He would listen to him. "Keith, where were you? Come sit down. You all right?" "Yeah," Keith answered, obediently taking the seat Shiro offered him, marveling at the concern. Why wouldn't he be all right? "You scared us," Shiro told his answer. "Red sank into the ground, and you were just gone." "Wait, didn't the Black Lion sink too?" Keith asked as Hunk appeared over his shoulder, reaching around to set down a bowl for him. This wasn't what he wanted to talk about, not even where he wanted to be, but his curiosity was getting the better of him. "No," Shiro said. "The Black Lion recovered from the ion blast after a few seconds, and we got off the ground as soon as we could. Then I couldn't find you." Keith heard the worry in the words. "What happened to you? How did you make it out?" Remembering that made Keith's throat feel way too tight to try and describe it. He didn't want to go back there. He guessed he was the only one who'd seen Malaya's soul try to manifest, the only one who'd been trapped with it. He gave an involuntary little shudder, then tried to hide it in a shrug. "Allura," he murmured to the table, realizing his chest still hurt. Hoping everyone would just accept that as the only answer they needed. They didn't have to know more than that, right? They wouldn't make him try to recount anything else. He didn't even think he could come up with the right words. He felt Shiro looking at him, and he knew that he was giving him all the signals that he was keeping something from him, that something was wrong. He also knew that Shiro would be the only one who wouldn't press him about it. At least not right now. He twisted in his seat, uncomfortable from several directions, searching for Hunk, who was putting together another tray near the stove, obviously for Lance. "You sure you're okay?" Shiro asked him. "Aren't you hungry?" Keith shook his head. He didn't feel like putting anything in his mouth. He was having a hard enough time breathing, so he didn't think he'd be able to swallow. "Not yet," he said, deliberately answering only one of the questions. "Hunk, you said the scan was clear?" He didn't want the big guy to forget, distracted by Shiro, or soup, or weird pressure in his lungs. He heard Pidge's spoon clink behind him. "Keith, look, I promise," Hunk assured him again. "Why would I lie to you?" "What's this about?" Shiro asked, obviously feeling as though he should be updated. "Keith, you needed a med scan?" "Keith's worried about Lance," Pidge volunteered, before Keith could say anything. "What? Why? Where is he?" Shiro streamed his words together rapidly, and Keith felt rather vindicated. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. He did seem strange right before the battle. Did something happen? Yes! Thank you, Shiro. Now they were going to get somewhere. Hunk was leaning against the counter, arms folded, frowning. Keith eyed him suspiciously, putting pressure with his fist against his breastplate. He may not be lying, but he was most definitely keeping something to himself. But why secret? But he was most definitely keeping something to himself. But why secrets? What did he think Keith was going to do? "Lance is fine, Shiro." Pidge rolled the words around her mouth so easily, like she truly believed them. "Physically, anyway." "What's that mean?" Keith jerked around to glare at her so fast he made himself dizzy. "Pidge," Hunk said warningly, causing her to shrug and gather up her dishes, rolling her eyes. "What?" she said, a little snappishly. "You want to be stuck in this ship for the next decaphoebe while they figure it out on their own? Because I don't know if you remember when we ran them, but the statistics are ridiculous." "Pidge," Hunk said again, pleading this time. "Fine," she huffed, shoving rather than handing her bowl to Hunk, who looked relieved despite the violence. "I'll be on the bridge." But on her way out she paused, softening, resting her hands on her hips. Way out, she paused, softening, resting her hands on her hips. "You're overreacting," she said, not looking at Keith, but he knew she was talking to him. He couldn't help it, though. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't help it. What the hell did she mean? Statistics and figuring things out. "But I guess it's nice to see you do have feelings." Then she was gone. Keith closed his eyes, shivery with emotions he had no names for, not sure having feelings was actually all that great. "Will someone please tell me what's going on?" he begged, gripping the table for stability, feeling like he'd returned from Malaya into an entire separate reality. He heard Hunk sigh, felt Shiro watching him with growing intensity. "Okay, let's start here," Hunk muttered, as if steeling himself for another fight. "What makes you think we're lying to you about Lance?" Ugh, really? He was going to make him say it? And worried, he let his gaze return to the table. Maybe that would make it easier. "I don't think you're lying," he said, very simply. "But really, no one is noticing how he's so quiet? He's acting different. And when he came out of his lion, he really looked hurt. Why are you ignoring that?" "I'm not ignoring it," Hunk explained, to Keith's astonishment, then went on before Keith could confront him. "It's not new." "What?" Keith breathed out the question, startled. "Let's be honest," Hunk said, holding out his hand. "Do you know that Lance is really behaving different? Or is it just that you only now started paying attention to him when he's not literally in your face?" "What?" Keith said again, stupidly, feeling slow and tired. "Unless Lance is specifically trying to pick a fight with you. Did you ever notice he was in the room before?" Hunk had both hands up now, fingers to thumbs, emphasizing his speech, which he'd slowed considerably. "Have you ever heard him say anything when he's not messing with you?" "No," Keith sulked, feeling a little attacked and very confused. He hadn't paid any attention to hardly any of them. He'd always considered himself alone. It was only just a few days ago where that had started to really bother him. "Then how would you know if he's different or not?" Keith quelled his desire to snarl, forcing himself reluctantly to admit that this response was all his own fault. If he didn't feel like part of the team, there was only one person he could blame for that. "I've been with him for years, and I swear, he's the same. It's just you're actually looking at him now when he's not trying to get your attention." "My attention?" Keith asked, frustrated, making Hunk groan. "I thought he hated me." "He doesn't hate you," he corrected. "Then why all the insults, the taunting, the challenge? Why did he push him away when they were on the floor by his lion? What on earth would he want Keith's attention for?" "Pidge is so right. You're hopeless," he concluded softly, placing one of his palms on his forehead. Keith glared at him. "Okay, but here's the real question," Hunk went on, his voice thick with the insinuation that what he was about to say should be so painfully obvious to Keith that he shouldn't really have to say it. "Why are you suddenly paying attention?" This time Keith did let out a frustrated growl, but choked on it, coughing roughly into his elbow. He didn't know what Hunk was talking about, but it was getting really obnoxious. His head was starting to hurt, and he didn't like how they were looking at him. What did they want him to say? Confess that watching Lance die in the canyon was high on the list of things he never wanted to do again, so yeah, he was being super vigilant about him right now. He didn't want him to be hurt, or alone, or changed in any way, not if he could do something about it. Basically, he just wanted... "Hunk, hang on a second," Shiro stepped in, for which Keith was grateful, until he switched his attention to something else Keith didn't want to talk about. "Keith, why are you still coughing? How much dust did you inhale while you were down there?" Keith shrugged irritably against Shiro's hands, which he'd settled against his back and chest. There'd been dust everywhere, getting into places it shouldn't. The closed cockpit, through the seams of his suit, an invasive sentient parasite, where hadn't it gotten to him? He knew what Shiro was asking, monitoring him for the pneumonia the planet had triggered in him previously, but this wasn't like before. He'd kept his visor down. Well, no, he'd taken his helmet, kept his visor down. Well, no, he'd taken his helmet off for a bit, but he'd only been exposed for... Actually, he couldn't grasp exactly how long, but not anywhere near what it had been. His chest hurt, but not like it had the first time. At least, not yet. Come on, Shiro commanded, making decisions, placing a hand under Keith's arm to lift him up. We can keep talking later. Let's go find Kuran, get you checked out. Keith stood, but pulled away from Shiro, resistant to another distraction. I'm taking this to Lance first, he stalled, taking a few steps toward Hunk and snatching the tray off the counter, earning him skeptical, concerned looks from both of them. If Shiro was right, which Keith had to admit to himself he might be, then he wanted to see Lance one more time before they shut him up in a pod, get things settled between them once and for all. The questions and uncertainty were killing him fast. Keith, I don't know, Hunk began, reaching for the tray himself. I don't think Lance can... I just want to check on him, Keith snapped, shifting himself slowly backward out of the kitchen, out of Hunk's reach. The yellow paladin looked heavenward, taking an exaggerated breath before dropping his hands to his sides. If what you've been telling me is true, I want to set some things straight. Or something, Hunk mumbled, almost unintelligibly. You think now's the only time for that? Shiro asked, unconvinced. Keith stared at him, an expression on his face that he knew only Shiro could read. He knew he wasn't making sense, but this was still important to him. He was so tired of the secrets and the hostility. He wanted to know what was causing Lance's suffering, if it wasn't an injury. He wanted to see him. Shiro sighed. Don't take too long, he commanded. And don't get him all worked up, Hunk lectured, salvaging what he could from an argument he'd barely fought. And we're doing the scan right after, Shiro added, looking stern, knowing full well how stubborn Keith could be about stuff like this. Okay, Keith agreed to everything, still backing up, trying not to cough again. He's gonna kill me, he heard Hunk muttering as the door closed behind him, which didn't make any sense. But he was moving away from them now, walking as quickly as he dared with a bowl full of soup balanced on the tray, feeling unbalanced anyway as he filtered through how everyone was acting toward him. If Lance wanted his attention, then why push him away? Why be such a jerk to him? If Lance wanted his attention, how had he not even noticed? Maybe he really was hopeless. He almost walked past Lance's room, still thinking hard, feeling disoriented. He stood outside the door, fingers curled tight around the tray handles, thinking that maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe he should put now. He told him very clearly to leave him alone. But why? No. If Pidge and Hunk weren't going to tell him, he was going to get his answers direct from Lance. It was better for the team and the mission if they had better communication. Plus, he really needed to know what his problem was. The pain in his eyes had been real, even if everyone insisted he wasn't physically hurt. Something was going on, and he wanted to fix it. He cleared his throat and tapped the button alongside the door with his elbow to open it, his determination softening into stealth as darkness spilled into the hallway. Keith entered Lance's room the same way he slipped through Galra's ships, core engaged, slightly hunched, holding the tray as if it were a weapon. It was so quiet in here, so quiet that he could hear Lance's heavy breathing, the slow rhythm of sleep. He set the tray down on Lance's desk with the exaggerated care of someone letting go of a motion-sensitive explosive, then turned to study Lance in the bed. He hadn't made a plan for this, but then again, plans weren't always his strong suit. In his mind, he'd imagined Lance would be awake, or maybe he'd be on the floor again. He took a step closer, his head tilting to one side, his arms crossing in front of him, just looking. It was clear that Hunk had tucked Lance in. They hadn't even bothered completely changing him out of uniform. The thermal undersuit covered Lance's arm that he'd pulled outside of the blankets. Keith felt his own breathing struggle to slow and deepen to match his teammates'. He did look better, peaceful, here. No bruises under his eyes, no blood on his lip. Pain no longer creased his brow. He looked healthy and beautiful, like nothing bad had ever happened to him. Keith smiled in spite of himself. Maybe they were right. Maybe Lance really was okay. He reached out. Maybe they were right. Maybe Lance really was okay. He reached out, but then stopped when he realized he didn't really know what he was doing. What was he planning on doing? Smoothing Lance's hair? Touching his hand? His face? No way. If he touched him, he'd wake up, and probably wouldn't be very happy to see Keith looming over his bed. But he still wanted to do it. He sort of wanted to just scoot Lance over and lie down next to him as they had in the canyon. It was stupid, and he knew it, but there were things he missed about being with Lance down there. Touching him hadn't been an issue, it had been a necessity. No one had teased or messed with them. They hadn't really fought at all, and Keith had unknowingly opened a part of himself to Lance in order to ease his vulnerability that now he couldn't close. He also didn't know how to handle it being open. He wanted Lance to look at him, talk to him, touch him. He didn't think he'd ever Lance. He leaned down so he could study him closer. Something sharp and painful cut into Keith's left lung suddenly, causing him to wince and cover the area with his hand. That was new. Like a firecracker had just gone off in his chest. His throat twitched, but he couldn't cough. He wasn't as ready as he thought to talk to Lance, and this definitely was not how he wanted to start any conversation. He didn't want to wake him up, but he didn't want to leave him either. He just wanted to stand here, quiet, looking at him, listening to him calmly breathing, drawing a piece from his sleeping form in some sort of timeless state where they weren't yelling at each other, where Lance wasn't pushing him away. It seemed like everyone was against him doing that, keeping them separated, forcing them apart. Now his own body was going to start with him? Then pain erupted from his lung, taking all his choices from him as he involuntarily vocalized his discomfort and dropped to the floor next to the bed. What was going on? What now? He rocked on his hand and knees, still pressing hard on his chest as he waited for the pain to ease, barely registering that there was movement above him on the bed. Lance was stirring. He'd have to get out of here. He'd have to stand up. He should have gone with Shiro after all. Keith? What are you doing here? Too late. He tried to lift his face up to look at Lance, but he couldn't. If anything, his body curled up tighter to the floor, against his will. It felt like there was something clawing his lung from the inside. Actual scratching and tearing. Keith started taking tiny, panting breaths to see if that would help. A draft went across his face as Lance quickly whipped his blankets off, dropping to his knees in front of Keith, gripping his shoulders. This was so far from anything Keith had intended when he'd come in here. Hey, what's going on? Keith, what's wrong with you? He had no idea, but he really wanted it to stop. He was trying to melt his bones into the floor to loosen the pressure in his rib cage. His vision was going blurry. He couldn't move or answer, though he heard himself whimper through clenched teeth. What was this? Why did it hurt so much? Why couldn't he catch a break? Lights! Lance yelled at the automated system, brightening the room. Keith had his eyes squeezed shut now, tensing against the pain, frantically trying to find a position of comfort. Exhaling didn't help. Inhaling did nothing. It was pain that did not respond to pressure. It felt like something was crawling in there. He started coughing, excruciatingly, savagely, desperate to expel the irritant. Keith, you're still coughing? Hang on. Hey! Lance raised his voice again. Kran? Shiro? Help! Keith was drowning, shock making him shiver. What was happening to him? He felt as trapped as when he'd been sinking into Malaya, but worse. Keith, can you? But he couldn't. Whatever it was Lance wanted, he couldn't. He coughed, and something wet and sticky splattered the back of his hand on the floor, but brought absolutely zero relief. The next second, more came up, covering his chin, dripping off onto the floor. Oh, Lance said, his control over his nerves slipping in his voice. That's a lot of blood. That's, Hurry up, guys! How much? Keith thought, panicky, not able to open his eyes to see. How much blood? Why was he suddenly coughing up blood? Where was Shiro? Is he suddenly coughing up blood? Where was Shiro? The tearing, scrabbling sensation was shifting, moving up and centering, the pain moving with it and presenting an even bigger problem as it entered a smaller area. He coughed again, freaking out as whatever it was suddenly lodged tight deep in his throat. Something had just blocked his windpipe. Keith! Lance continued to hover over him in a helpless frenzy, hands on his back or shoulder, constantly moving in search of some way to assist. What are you doing? Did you just stop breathing? Dude, breathe! I can't. I am trying, Keith screamed internally, both his hands clawing at his own throat, the cause of his distress also clawing, still shifting as if it had thousands of little talons, each trying to find a hold against the slippery lining of Keith's trachea. What are you even choking on? Lance demanded, fierce and frightened, way too lack, which didn't help. Think, McLean, Lance talked to himself, as Keith fought to breathe, to stay conscious. This was not how he'd imagined dying, suffocating on a bedroom floor, Lance's bedroom floor, in who knew what galaxy. After all he'd been through, it seemed insulting. His irritated lungs began to burn, signaling their need for air. Lance was pulling on him. Abdominal thrusts, he was saying. Keith, you need to lie on your back. Can you even hear me? Keith! But that wasn't necessary. The blockage in Keith was moving on its own, struggling to get out. Before Lance could pull him down, the unmistakable sensation of tiny legs pulled closer to the wider space at the back of Keith's throat, allowing him to once again cough, this time with enough force to finally push it all the way out. Something frantically wriggling hit his tongue and scampered toward the roof of his mouth, triggering his gag reflex with such severity that he was very, very glad he hadn't touched Hunk's soup. He dimly heard Lance screaming in the background as he vomited a huge, iridescent, blood-covered beetle onto the floor. What the hell? Lance shrieked as the insect began skittering away, trying to find a hiding place. Catch it, Keith gulped, his voice torn to shreds, his whole body going limp. God, air was fantastic. So good. Now if only he could stop twitching. Keith! Lance yelled as his eyes rolled back. He didn't even feel it when his head hit the floor. His fight response woke up before he did, his hands uncontrollably tearing at his body, sweeping it clean of the insects he felt certain were crawling all over him. All the thousands of legs prickling over his skin, digging at him under his clothes. He moaned in disgust. Easy, Shiro's voice filtered into his consciousness. You're all right. Nothing's on you. Insect legs turned to guiding hands as he was pulled from the healing pod and seated on the stairs in front of it. Safe, but disoriented. He hesitantly opened his eyes, testing what Shiro had told him, seeing nothing but the clean white healing suit, his own trembling hands. He lifted his head slowly, taking stock of his surroundings, trying to remember what happened to him, how he'd gotten here. It was very bright. Someone put a blanket over his shoulders as he hunched over his knees, panting on the steps. His lungs were fine, clear after the healing pod. His breathing rang loud in his ears, blocking all other sound. Anyone, he said, then had to shake his head hard to clear it as the word reverberated through his skull, the way sound moves sometimes when his ears were clogged. Anyone gonna fill me in? Look at me, Shiro commanded, and immediately focused Keith's struggling attention. Yeah, that's better. There you are. Can you hear me now? Shiro, Keith said, making and keeping eye contact, wondering how long Shiro had been talking to him before. What happened to me? Shiro looked away momentarily, having a silent conversation with someone else in the room. Keith followed his eyes to find himself surrounded by the entire team. How long had he been asleep? You inhaled a bug, Pidge explained, stepping slightly forward from the group. I mean, sort of. We actually think you made it, or animated it. I don't understand what you're talking about, Keith said testily, voice raising. Keep calm, Shiro instructed, putting a hand on Keith's shoulder. We aren't sure, but Pidge thinks that the dust you inhaled in Malaya used your quintessence somehow to gather together. And reanimate. Like a host, Pidge put in helpfully, except Keith hardly ever understood her when she was spouting scientific slang. Or an incubator? You, hatched a beetle, Keith. Where is it? Keith asked, remembering the brilliantly colored insect that he'd spit out of his mouth before he blacked out. Did you catch it? He heard Hunk snicker from his side as Pidge produced a transparent beaker-shaped unit from her backpack. She handed it to him, but he didn't take it from her, forcing her to hold it out awkwardly until she realized he was not going to touch it. She set it on the ground in front of him instead. Scuttling around inside was the beetle. Pidge had somehow cleaned the blood off it, so it now gleamed purple, green, and jet black. It had more legs than an earth beetle, and watching it made Keith unconsciously start scratching lightly at his neck, as the memory of its Yeah, Pidge agreed, eyes gleaming and voice eager. But such a great specimen to figure out the whole Malaya puzzle. Such a tragic waste of soup, though, Hunk lamented beside Keith. Well, what else did I have to catch it with? Lance's voice huffed from somewhere behind the rest of them. Hunk snickered again. What happened? Keith asked, looking at each of their faces in turn, their calm, amused expressions that had shared a joke without him, something he wanted to be part of, something that wasn't dark or choking him. Hunk was laughing too hard to talk now, face close to Keith's as he doubled over. Keith smiled unconsciously, though he felt inexplicably worried. Hunk wheezed, but absolutely couldn't talk for laughing. When we got to the room... Oh, shut up, Lance scoffed, shoving his hands in his pockets and blushing, trying hard not to smile, too. We were coming to help, Pidge said, not doing much better talking over her laughter than Hunk. We were coming to help, Pidge said, not doing much better talking over her laughter than Hunk. And the door opened, and Lance was... Between intense laughing fits, they told Keith how they'd found them. Keith unconscious on the floor, covered in Hunk's soup, because Lance had just grabbed the first thing he could lay his hands on that might catch a quick-moving insect, and had spilled it everywhere. And he just kept yelling, "Shut the door! Shut it! Where'd it go?" Pidge mimicked, holding her sides. From on top of the bed, like those dumb cartoons where women leap on chairs because they saw a mouse, holding the bowl and eyes going everywhere. Shiro had apparently closed the door tight behind them, going immediately to tend to Keith, when Lance made a flying jump off the bed and slammed the bowl onto the floor. Keith guessed he could see why that would have looked funny. They'd all missed the first part, where he'd been asphyxiating to death. They'd missed all the danger. What are you going to do with it? His nose wrinkling as he tried not to look at what might have been his murderer, though he could hear its awful legs ticking against the sides of the container. Study it, Pidge managed, calming down. See how it did what it did. See if we can't work something similar to restore the whole planet. Keith locked eyes with her, horrified. No, you can't, he said seriously, breathing speeding up. Relax, Keith, Alora spoke, breaking from the group. He couldn't remember if she'd been there from the start or if she'd come in later, unnoticed. We will not be returning to Malaya any time soon. Or never, Keith shot back, making Shiro pat him reassuringly. Anyway, it's time you got some rest. Shiro changed the subject. While you can. He helped Keith to stand as Pidge collected the beetle from the floor, safely putting it back in her bag. I'll take him, Lance volunteered, softly, hands still in his pockets, expression dead neutral. Keith didn't miss the look Hunk and Pidge gave each other before they hurriedly slipped out of the room. Shiro stood still, deliberating, before nodding consent and stepping away, towards Allura. Keith waited obediently as Lance walked over to him, watching him intently as he moved, appreciating how someone as tall as Lance could move so lightly. Well, come on, mullet, Lance said, nodding toward the door, walking with the expectation that Keith would follow. Still with the blanket over his shoulders, Keith trailed after Lance, catching up to walk beside him with his head down. Dude, I thought you were gonna die, Lance began heatedly before they had gone very far. I thought the same thing, Keith admitted. What were you doing in my room? Lance asked immediately afterward. Keith pulled the blanket around himself as a shield. Hunk had me bring you soup, Keith offered as an excuse. I was seeing if you were awake when you scared the shit out of me? Keith stopped talking, but he was thinking of a lot he wanted to say. How Lance had scared the shit out of him first, over and over again, from the very first fall into the canyon and practically every second afterward. Here's your room, Lance pointed out, opening the door for him. What? Already? Keith took a step inside, but turned to look back at Lance. He wasn't going to leave him yet, was he? The blue eyes were full of hurt again, a strange expression in the twist of Lance's mouth. Get some rest, Lance said, turning to go. Keith felt his soul sort of sinking, slipping away from him, making him feel cold and lost. He didn't want to be alone, didn't want Lance to leave him, didn't even want to rest. He reached out before making a decision about it, grabbing Lance's wrist, stopping him. This again? Lance asked. Lance sighed. You want me to stay with you a while? He offered. Keith nodded.